Good evening. Okay. Is this on? Hello. Good evening. I'm Steve Riggio, Chief Operating Officer of Barnes & Noble, and I'd like to welcome everyone here to what will surely be a very lively evening. You know, it's always a pleasure to introduce new writers, as we often do here at Barnes & Noble. Just a month ago, I was introducing Chang Ray Lee, the author of Native Speaker, and he won our Discover Great New Writers Award for 1995. Tonight, we're here to rediscover not just a great author, but a new edition of one of his most important works. I was going to introduce our moderator, but we do have a surprise guest, so it is my great pleasure to introduce Bill Murray.
I'm surprised also. I was hoping for more time while the moderator fumbled for words. I've been asked to read an excerpt from Huckleberry Finn, and the one that I'm going to read was originally published in Life on the Mississippi, but has been reinserted, correctly I guess, into Huckleberry Finn. Mark Twain, please hold your applause until we decide as a group whether or not he deserves applause. This is a scene between Huckleberry Finn and Jim. I've been in a storm here once before with Tom Sawyer and Joe Harper, Jim. It was a storm like this too last summer. We didn't know about this place, and so we got soaked. The lightning tore a big tree all to flinders. Why don't lightning cast a shadow, Jim? Well, I reckon it do, but I don't know. Well, it don't. I know. The sun does, and a candle does, but the lightning don't. Tom Sawyer says it don't, and it's so. Sure, child, I reckon you're mistaken about that. Give me the gun. I was going to see. So he stood up the gun in the door and held it. And when it lightened, the gun didn't cast any shadow. Jim says, well, that's mighty curious. That's uncommon curious. Now, they say that a ghost don't cast no shadow. Why is that, you reckon? Of course, the reason is that ghost is made out of lightning. Or else the lightning is made out of ghosts. But I don't know which it is. I wish I know which it is, Huck. Well, I do too, but I reckon there ain't no way to find out. Did you ever see a ghost, Jim? Has I ever seen a ghost? Well, I reckon I has. Oh, tell me about it, Jim. Tell me about it. The storms are ripping and a tearing and a carrying on so a body can hardly talk, but I reckon I'll try. Long time ago, when I was about 16-year-old, my young Miles William, that's dead now, was a student in Doctor College in the village where we lived in. That college was a powerful, big brick building, 3 stories high, and stood all by herself in a big open place out to the edge of the village. Well, one night in the middle of winter, young Miles William, he told me to go to the college and go upstairs to the dissecting room on the 2nd floor and warm up a dead man that was there on the table and get him soft so he can cut him up. Oh, what for, Jim? I don't know. See if he can find something in him, maybe. Anyways, that's what he told me, and he told me to wait there till he comes. So I takes a lantern and starts out across the town. But it was a blowing and a sleeting and cold. There wasn't nobody stirring in the streets, and I could scarcely shovel on against the wind. It was most midnight and dreadful dark. I was mighty glad to get to the place. Child, I unlocked the door and went upstairs to the dissecting room. That room was 60 feet long and 25 foot wide, and all along the wall, on both sides, was the long black gowns hanging that the students wears when they's chopping up the dead people. Well, I goes swinging the lantern along, and the shadows of them gowns went spreading out and drawn in along the wall, and it scared me. It looked like they was swinging their hands to get warm. Well, I never looked at them no more, but it seemed like they was doing it behind my back just the same. There was a table about 40 foot long down the middle of the room with 4 dead people on it, laying on their backs and with their knees up and the sheets over them. You could see the shapes, under the sheets. Well, Miles Williams, he told me to warm up the big man with the big black whiskers. So I uncovered one, and he didn't have no whiskers. But he had his eyes wide open, and I covered him up quick, I bet you. The next one was such a ghastly sight that I most let the lantern drop. Well, I skipped one carcass and went for the last one. I raised up the sheet and I says, "All right, boss, you're the chap I was after." He had the black whiskers and he was a rattling big man and looked wicked like a pirate. He was naked. They all was. He was laying on round sticks, rollers. I took the sheet off of him and rolled him along, feet first, to the end of the table before the fireplace. His legs was apart and his knees was, cocked up some. So when I uprighted him, he got sat up there looking pretty natural, with his feet out and his big toes sticking out like he was warming himself. I propped him up with the rollers, and then I spread the sheet over his back and over his head to help warm him. And then when I was tying the corners under his chin, by jinx, he opened his eyes. I let go and stood off and looked at him, feeling mighty shaky. Well, he didn't look at nothing particular and didn't do nothing, so I know that he was good and dead yet. But I just couldn't stand them eyes, It made me feel all overish just to look at him. So I pulled up the sheet clear down over his face and under his chin and tied it hard. And then there he sat, all naked in front with his head like a big snowball and the sheet covering his back and falling down on the table behind. So there he sat with his legs spread out, but blame if he didn't look no better than what he did before. His head was so awful somehow. But them eyes was covered up, so I reckoned I let him stand at that and not try to improve him up no more. Well, I stood, I stooped between his legs on the hearthstone and took the candle out of the lantern and held it in my hand so as to make more light. There were some embers in the fireplace, but the wood was, all to the other side end of the room. Whilst I was stooping there, getting ready to go out to the wood, the candle flickered. And I thought, the old man moved his legs. It kind of made me shiver. I put out my hand and felt his leg that was poked along past my left jaw, and it was cold as ice. So I reckon he didn't move. Then I felt that leg was poked past my right jaw, and it was powerful cold too. You see, I was stooping down right betwixt it. But pretty soon I thought I see his toes move. You know, they was just in front of me on both sides right here. I tell you, honey, I was getting uneasy. You see, that was a great big old rambling building and nobody but me in it. And that man over me with that sheet over his face and the wind a-wailing round the place like spirits that was in trouble, and the sleet driving again the glass, and then the clock struck 12 in the village, and it was so far away, and the wind choked up the sound so that it was only sound like a moan, that's all. Well, things I wish I was out in this. You know, what is going to become of me? And this fella moving his toes, I knows it, you know. I can see him move, and I can just feel them eyes of his and see that old dumpling head of his all done up in the sheet. And, well, so just at that minute, down he comes, right astraddle my neck with his cold legs, and kicked the candle out. My, what did you do, Jim? Do? Well, I never done nothing, only I just got up and healed it in the dark. I wasn't going to wait to find out what he wanted. No, sir, I just split down the stairs and linked it home, a yelping every jump. What did Mars Williams say? He said I was a fool. He went there and found a dead man on the floor, all comfortable, and took him and chopped him up. Dod rot him, I wish I'd had a hack at him. What made him hop on to your neck, Jim? Well, Mars Williams said I didn't prop him up good with the rollers. I don't know. There weren't no way for a dead man to act no how. It might have scared some people to death. But Jim, he weren't rightly a ghost. He was only a dead man. Didn't you ever see a real sure enough ghost? Oh, you bet I have. Lots of them. Well, tell me about them, Jim. All right. I will. Sometime. But the storms are slacking up now, so we better go and tend to the lines and bait them again.
Evening, ladies and gentlemen. Mike, I don't know how I can follow that act, right? Thank you all for coming out this evening, and let me just introduce our panel before I make a few opening remarks and get the festivities underway. First, I'd like to introduce Shelby Foote. William Styron. Roy Blount Jr. Justin Kaplan. I said, gentlemen, Isn't this a beautiful store? It's a gorgeous place. Gorgeous building. It's good to see people in bookstores. Thank you for coming out this evening and talking about a 114-year-old book. I was telling Mr. Styron we should all be so lucky. 114 years from now, people are arguing and fighting and gouging each other's eyes out about what we've written. Yeah, that too. How you doing back there? First of all, let me just begin perhaps as Twain would and tell you a brief story about myself to identify myself to you. My name is Brent Staples, and I write editorials for the New York Times. Thank you. And other things, but I began my journalistic life in Chicago. And like most people, perhaps, who had skipped Mark Twain in junior high school, I probably would never have opened the book, but that I was at my desk one day at the Chicago Sun-Times, which was a tabloid where people smoked cigars and covered murders and the mob. And one day a phone rang, and there was a gentleman with a complaint about Huck Finn, and I got the call. And the gentleman was incensed at the fact that the word nigger appeared in Huck Finn so many times, several hundred times, I don't know the exact count. And he wanted to enlist me in a campaign to publish an expurgated version of Huck Finn without the word nigger. He suggested Negro in some places, slave in the other places. And there ensued a 1-hour conversation with this gentleman in which I tried to explain to him that expunging the word nigger from Huck Finn would not expunge the history that was associated with the word nigger. That, in fact, by taking that word out of the novel, he could not erase several hundred years of slavery. He could not erase, several hundred years of suffering and American apartheid. And by taking it out, he might, in fact, obscure those years and deny a basic reality. But let me just say, if I seem to be demeaning the man's position, I am. Because it's not very smart. He was making a kind of linguistic confusion. He was making a confusion between a word and a set of historical events it signified. And he was trying to erase them. And so after about an hour and a half, they came to me with another story, and we had to leave off that conversation. That man went on, by the way, to do a national campaign. And he enlisted a bunch of school teachers and a bunch of librarians, and he went to city councils, and he said, this is a horrendous, terrible thing. It's a racist term. We've got to either get a clean version of this or kick it out of the libraries. Hence, as my colleague, Mr. Styron, said in the New Yorker recently, Huck Finn will never escape the vortex of controversy that has embraced it from its very first days. 114 years ago, a boy ran away from home. He met a runaway slave, and they set out on a river. And they are effectively still there, going downstream. And we are still arguing about the significance of their encounter. There are stupid criticisms of Huck Finn. And I'm sorry if you hold one stupid ones, I'm not here to... There are stupid criticisms of Huck Finn, and there are substantive criticisms of Huck Finn. And some of them are technical. My colleague, Ed Doctorow, thinks that it was lazily written, that Twain this is fashion. Let the book write itself. Let it sit around in drawers, came back to it, lost continuity, and then threw together some devices for the Sawyer section at the end. And Doctorow thinks this is unforgivable. There are other criticisms, technical criticisms there in the New Yorker recently. But the history of this controversy continues to plague us. We had a recent editorial, editorial is what I do for a living. We had a recent story by the novelist Jane Smiley in Harper's. How many of you have seen that story? I will allude to that, an essay, I will allude to that today. Devaluing Huck Finn, because in Miss Smiley's words, it really evades the serious business of slavery. the ugliness of slavery. It turns Jim into an easy thing to swallow, into a kind of bovine pet on the raft going downstream. It evades the kind of ugliness that Harriet Beecher Stowe set forth in Uncle Tom's Cabin, where slaves commit suicide, are sold off, are beaten to death, are starved. I spoke with with Jane Smiley about an hour and a half ago. She couldn't be here. We tried to get her. And I asked her what had happened since that essay appeared. And she said the hate mail has never ceased. And that people have besieged her at every point, haranguing her about demeaning this great work of art. And let me just read to you a few of her comments about Huck Finn. It appeals to white male readers because it takes racism as a private matter between Huck and Jim. It encourages white people not to understand the other aspects of racism. If you say you are racist, they will catalog in their minds the black people they know and say, no. The book does not serve to enlighten the debate about the other parts of racism. It leaves racism as a private matter between Huck and Jim. What I was saying is that there was a time when the debate was public. She's talking about Harriet Beecher Stowe's novel here. The debate was public in that novel. The debate goes on from the beginning to the end. That kind of public debate of what we would consider private issues was a feature of our lives before the Civil War. That's the only point I was making about Uncle Tom's Cabin. If that public debate had happened 150 years ago and gone on, and these issues had continued to be publicly discussed, perhaps there wouldn't be the kinds of suspicion and anxiety and institutionalized racism we see today. Things have become unspeakable. I was thinking about that. The more things are debated, the more things change. Talking becomes easier about them. And so we have those two books set side to side in that essay, Uncle Tom's Cabin and Huck Finn. And there's a gross comparison that can be made between the two. And there's some silly comparisons that can be made between two, and we can strip them down and get to the substantive one. Now, the first criticism about the appearance of the word nigger, of course, we can dismiss. I walked between my office and 8th Avenue this morning. I heard the word nigger at least 100 times. I mean, it was in the rap music. It was in the guys walking down the street jiving with one another, because in New York now it's just a harmless pronoun. Hey, nigger, what's up? In certain communities. So that we dismiss that criticism. But the criticism that Twain, in a cavalier way, sort of reduces Nigger Jim to a kind of bovine, featureless character whose main purpose is to be a sidekick, a Tonto-like character of Huck's, is one I think we need to get to, and I don't think we can really as easily dismiss that. Before I start, let me just read Ralph Ellison's assessment of that. It is not all that odd that this black-faced figure of white fun is for Negroes a symbol of everything they rejected in the white man's thinking about race. When he appears, for example, in the guise of Nigger Jim, the Negro is made uncomfortable. Writing at a time when the black-faced minstrel was still popular, and shortly after a war which left even the abolitionists weary of these problems associated with the Negro, Twain fitted Jim into the outlines of the minstrel tradition. And it is from behind this stereotype mask that Jim's dignity and human capacity and Twain's complexity emerge. So Ellison takes a different view from Jane Smiley, and in her absence, I will have to take her part as we pursue. And let me just say, I'm moderating here under protest because there's no women on this panel. So, as time goes on, hello? Can you hear me? Well, I can just use my own voice. As time goes on, I will inject a few points of Jane Smiley. To begin, I would like to turn to Mr. Styron who's had some experience. Mr. Styron has had some experience in being charged with creating simplistic black characters. So for those of you who are worn out of long pants then, I think it was 1968 when he published his Nat Turner novel. And basically, you know, Nat Turner was the leader of a slave rebellion who caused considerable damage and did considerable mayhem to white people in Virginia before he was hung. And Mr. Styron's characterization of that came under considerable attack, primarily for Nat Turner's affections and attractions to a certain white woman in the novel. So Mr. Styron knows about this charge. So speak, if you will, to Ms. Smiley's charge, please.
Well, I would add, just as a postscript to what Brent Staples said about, I'm going to not use the euphemism N-word. Is that all right? I just say old nigger, just as it should be said, because that's what we all understand it to be. A lot of people pussyfoot around it. I'm rather defensive and collegial about Huck Finn because I was attacked too, as Brent Staples just pointed out. Curiously enough, I can be exact about the word nigger and its frequency in Huckleberry Finn because John Wallace, the black educator that Brent just mentioned, who did indeed publish a totally bowdlerized version of Huckleberry Finn from which all uses of the word nigger were removed, made a count, and the actual count is 231 times. In the Confessions of Nat Turner, my novel, I made a count, or I had my, an employee make a count, and it was 188 times. Now, curiously enough, I think this is an interesting sociological fact, that when the book came out, my book came out, it was attacked on all levels you can possibly imagine. It was attacked for racism, sexism. It was attacked for bigotry. I was accused of being morally senile, of being corrupt, of being a nasty race baiter. You name it, I was called it. But I was never once criticized for using the word nigger 188 times, which I think is an interesting fact in itself. My own view about Jane Smiley, who is a writer of extreme intelligence and talent, is that this is one of the stupidest essays ever written. I read it with growing dread and fascination as I realized that there was some sort of ghastly subtext there which I couldn't quite grasp, but that virtually every other sentence was either a canard, an exaggeration, or, to my mind, an outright lie. Now, to me, the most single, I jotted this down in the car coming down because I had the article from Harper's in my briefcase. And I think the place where she misses the point most directly and most stupidly is, and I'm going to quote it. This is from Jane Smiley.
And I'm going to defend her, too. Go ahead.
Okay, fair enough. To give credit to Huck suggests that the only racial insight Americans of the 19th and 20th century are capable of is a recognition of the obvious, that blacks, slave and free, are human. Now, on the surface, that's perfectly unexceptional, it seems to me, until you examine it in the light of Huck Finn himself. Because to my mind, the vivid moral courage of Huck Finn himself, the boy, the 12-year-old boy, is that he's the only person, virtually only white person in the book, who does see that Jim is human. This was a time, the slave period, of unspeakable horror and cruelty, in which black people were bought and sold routinely like animals. And I think when you examine the character of Huck Finn, you see just that he's the only one who recognizes Jim's humanity. And therefore, from my mind...
I'm out here
Where
right
are you?
directly in front of you, right down the aisle.
Okay.
Let me just counter to that.
Okay.
Briefly. Miss Smiley, in taking the counter example, and any of you gentlemen, please jump in after I ask this question, please. Don't sit there demurely, especially you, Mr. Foote. In her counter example of Uncle Tom's Cabin, she talks about the variety of characters in the slave experience. She talks about the slave woman who, in fact, kills a child instead of letting the child be sold outright. She talks about the characters who acquiesce to slavery, the characters who fight it, the characters who are cunning and quiet in their tact to evade punishment. She talks about a whole range of character experiences. One of her beefs, and this is Miss Smiley's beef, not mine, one of her beefs with this character of Jim is that he's just a little bit too loyal, that he's just a little bit too featureless, that he's just a little bit too much the sort of minstrel goody who can be, amusing for rooms full of white folks.
Well, I mean, I think that's true, but still, I mean, the Garrison Keillor did a show a while back that James Earl Jones played Jim and Garrison played Huck 20 years later. They ran back into each other somewhere. Jim had become a famous actor in Europe, as a matter of fact. And Jim was saying that he didn't remember the book that way. He said, I read your book, Huck, but that's not the way I remember it. And it wound up with Huck trying to borrow $20. And so, I mean, it's a book written by a white man, and there's, Joel Chandler Harris wrote those Uncle Remus stories, and which are wonderful stories. And now, there are little introductory sections where the little white kid talks to Uncle Remus in a condescending way that are just awful. But once you get the stories, they're real good stories. But I don't think there's none of that kind of condescension in Huck Finn. If you go back and read the snotty little white kid talking to Uncle Remus, and that's really unpleasant to read. I don't find anything in Huckleberry Finn at all unpleasant that way. It seems to me Huck and Jim are on the same level. Of course, Huck is a kid, so that's. But then there's Charles Chestnut, who was a black writer, had a storyteller named Uncle Julius, and it's instructive to compare a black writer's Uncle Julius with the white writer's Uncle Remus. And the Uncle Julius is a lot cleverer and more wily and less sweet, less nice than. It seems to me that if a black person had written Huck Finn, it's such an academic thing, but if it had not been a white person writing Huck Finn, that Jim might have been a fuller and more interesting character. But that's what I'm reminded of. Dawn Powell said once that criticisms of her latest novel boil down to the critics saying, if they had my automobile, they wouldn't go visit my folks, they'd visit theirs. And I think Huck Finn is such a wonderful book. I mean, the great thing about it is that it keeps coming up, and it keeps giving us chances to talk about about things like this. I mean, it's a great pretext for discussions about delicate racial issues, because it's fun to read, if nothing else, and it also has its limitations. And like everything else, it goes completely crazy in the last few chapters, which is
Mr. Foote, what about Miss Smiley's notion that she's trying to get at? She admits today that she didn't do this as successfully as she might have in her Harper's essay, which I know you hold in low esteem. But she said one of the distinctions she's trying to make a distinction between a work of literature that express on the surface a discussion about slavery and social conditions among the characters, among the white characters, among the black characters, between white characters and black characters, and a book that does not. What do you make of her observation of that?
I make it practically valueless. I judge a novel in large part by its writing. And I think, as a novelist, I know a great novel from a bad novel. Huck Finn's a great novel. Uncle Tom's Cabin is a bad novel. And I can't back that up. I just believe it. That's what I sense out of reading the two books. I never managed to finish Uncle Tom's Cabin. Twain is somebody that has to be gotten at from a sort of angle. He's a very strange man. He's known for his humor and even for his wit. He had very little of either. What he had was an enormous sense of the ridiculous. He posits two things that just won't fit together, and he brings that off in a marvelous way. That's what he has. Twain himself was a colorful character, and Twain being so colorful makes his writing colorful. There's a little story about Twain, what he was like. He was a member of the Players Club here, and he hung out there a good deal. And members took turns with jobs that they had to do, like he was chairman of the Visitors Committee one time. He was in the bar having a drink, and a stranger came up, a visitor obviously, and said, "Could you tell me where the men's room is?" Mark Twain said, "Here, piss on me, I'm chairman of the Visitors Committee."
X-rated. Cut that out of the tape.
That's Twain, and that's in Huckleberry Finn, too. That kind of thing, and it's not in Uncle Tom's Cabin, I'll tell you.
Yes, Mr. Kaplan.
Well, I wrote a rejoinder to Jane Smiley, whom, by the way, I respect and admire as a fiction writer enormously.
He's getting ready to murder her when he says that.
I wrote a rejoinder to her as an essay in the New York Times Book Review, and I have any number of bones to pick with her, but the point that was just brought up, that she claims that Uncle Tom's Cabin allows a number of voices to participate. I think she's got a novel confused with drive time call-in radio. That's not the function of a novel. The function of a novel is to present a point of view and a set of characters looked at very closely. And another point that I'd like to make is that, since Roy brought up the subject of Uncle Remus's wonderful stories, I've always thought of Huckleberry Finn as the equivalent of the tar baby in Uncle Remus's story. It's the tar baby that we can't get rid of it. It's stuck to us. It's Mark Twain is our Brer Rabbit. We'll have to live with it. It's painful, but it's wonderful too.
Well, tell me, what do you find painful about the book?
That it will cause a lot of pain to people. For example, I can imagine a young black person in a high school teaching situation being horribly mortified and hurt by the 200 and whatever it is repetitions of the
31.
word nigger. 231. And by the way, you'll find not quite so many, but a significant number of uses of the word nigger in Uncle Tom's Cabin, and no one squawks about that. But it does cause pain, and I think the way to answer that is to suggest that Huckleberry Finn is not Little House on the Prairie, and that one of the functions of great fiction is to disorient and dismay and to upset you, to make you think and feel differently. And this book certainly does it.
One more time down this path. Mr. Styron, in The New Yorker, you mentioned that you thought, in passing, that Twain had ambivalent feelings about race. Yeah. And could you flesh out what brings you to think that and what judgment you make about that?
Well, I would probably have to flesh it out by saying that I said it because I think all Americans throughout history, white and black, have had ambivalent feelings about race. And specifically speaking about white people, I always like to recall early conversation with my late and beloved friend Robert Penn Warren, who had an extraordinary understanding about the race situation in America as well as anyone I know in his time. And he simply said, I think he was probably being slightly flamboyant, but I remember being on a walk with him. He says, don't you realize all Americans are racist? He said, Thomas Jefferson was racist. Abraham Lincoln was racist. He says, we're all racist. But he was trying to, I think, say that if you remove the word racist and pare that down somehow, he was trying to say what I recapitulated in the statement you attribute to me in the New Yorker, which is, I said, Huckleberry Finn reveals the mind of a writer with equivocal feelings about race. And I would like to assert, as unequivocally as I possibly can at this moment, that almost every American has equivocal feelings about race. And it would have been entirely unnatural, seems to me, as splendid a man as Mark Twain was, as compassionate and warm as we and a decent person as he was. It's amazing to me that he had so little racism, given the fact that he was a child of his time, that he grew up in a town which knew slavery, and that he had actually joined briefly the Confederate Army. I'm astounded that this book, with this heavy weight of race consciousness on it, and the heavy burden of hatred that was hovering over Missouri in that time, that the book is so free of all of these horrible things that have haunted us for all these many years. That's my view of the thing.
I think that, I honestly believe that Huckleberry Finn is the great anti-slavery tract of them all. Huck is about as racist as you can get. And what he does is he recognizes that Jim is a man, a wise and good man. And he says he was going to help him escape. He said, all right, I'll go to hell. But he believes, as a racist, that his sympathies for Jim were going to send him to hell. And that's the turning point of the novel. It's the point the novel builds up to and then floats away from. His recognition that Jim is a man like any other man. And it's very clear to Huck that that's his feeling, and he's willing to go to hell believing it. We're all racists. Robert Penn Warren's right. We all have that. I was brought up on it. I was not allowed to use the word nigger in my home. My folks would not let me use that word. They wanted me to say colored people, which is, to my mind, about as bad. But it was a word that was in common use for everyday things. People who didn't say the word when it applied to a person applied it to things. Brazil nuts were called nigger toes. A slingshot was called a nigger shooter. Now, this was utterly unconscious. It's about as racist as you can get, but it was no thought. I remember coming home from school one day, and Nellie was there. She worked for us for 28 years, black woman. Incidentally, made $3 a week when she started, and 28 years later was making $12 a week. I, sometime or other, realized that every morsel of food I ever put in my mouth, every thread of clothes I ever had on my back, every hour of education I ever had, anything else came out of exploiting black people. I knew that perfectly well. It doesn't reduce my racism, but it helps me to reduce it. I came home from school, and Nellie was there, and I was looking around for my slingshot. And I said, Nellie, where's my nigger shooter? She said, I think it's back on your bureau back there. It was to her as unconsciously said as to me saying it. It was just a word that was in the language that applied to things. It didn't apply to people. For Twain not to use it would have been the crazy thing. And somehow or another, people can't get past that word. Mm-hmm. And it's painful. It's like the Confederate battle flag. It really hurts people. They see it as a representation of all that's oppressed them for so many years.
In my stature as honorary woman, I need to ask one more question, and then I'll open up the audience. You can join in this here now that we've heard from everyone. We also asked Mary Gordon to come and join this panel, but she wasn't able to. And she did say at the time that that Huck Finn is a little boy's book. It's a men's book, and it's mainly about flight from female power and authority. And in some sense, I guess, to put a few words in Mary's mouth, that leaves it sort of half a book. Yeah. Mr. Foote?
It is a boy's book. I read it as a boy with great pleasure. Liked it better than Tom Sawyer. What is interesting about Twain is he doesn't like Tom Sawyer either in Huckleberry Finn. Tom Sawyer represents literary things and copying out of books and things. And Huck is a natural force, and so is Jim. And to juxtapose Huck against Tom and Jim against the people around him is it's greatly to Twain's credit how well they come off by that comparison.
Now, I think women, I'm sorry,
yeah.
Women do just seem generally to play the role in Huckleberry Finn of getting in the way of the men wanting to do what they want to do, or nagging the men one thing or another. But in lots of women's novels I can think of, the men just seem to play the role of getting in the way of the women. So
also, you have to remember that Huck is really on the run from his father.
Yes.
There's only one brief mention of even reminding you that Huck once had a mother. It's not very important.
I think having to do with race, I mean, part of the Mark Twain talked about himself as being a great mongrel and all sorts of things. And there's a book by Shelley Fisher Fishkin called Was Huck Black, which I thought sounded silly until I read it. And in fact, she made the point that Southern white characters in comic novels before Huck had completely different speech rhythms, and that Huck was the first white character in a comic novel to have a little bit of the rhythm of African Americans.
And by the way, a lot of English visitors to the States in the 1840s came back and were appalled by the fact, by recognizing that a lot of white kids, most white kids growing up on the plantation, that is the sons of the slave owners, sounded more like slaves than like white people up north. It was part of the culture.
Yeah, I mean, that's a great, the South is, I have argued that Southern culture is Africo-Celtic or Celtico-African as opposed to Anglo-Saxon. And it's a big difference from the Northeast for that reason. Yeah. I was just thinking that almost all it seems to be great things in American culture are mixtures of black and white, and just obviously so. I mean, all of American popular music that's any good is that. And it seems to me that Huckleberry Finn in some ways is sort of like rock and roll, in that it's a mixture of black rhythm and black blues with white adolescence and white marketing.
Right.
What would account, I think, and I'm not just asking this, but what accounts for the staying power of this book? Surely not just its goodness. I mean, there are a lot of good books that are wonderfully written, but 114 years out, some of these questions that I've asked, and some of the observations that were made the first time it was published, certainly not those about race, but others about its general crudeness and so forth, were made the first time it appeared. What accounts for this book's staying power?
I don't think there's any doubt about what accounts for its staying power. It's a great book. Hemingway said American literature came out of Huckleberry Finn, and I think he's close to the truth on that. It taught us the use of our own language. This American language has been used in vaudeville skits, and it had been used by one man before Twain with enormous effect, and that's Abraham Lincoln, who really knew how to use American English. But it's Mark Twain who was the literary person who spoke the American language in the way he does in Huck Finn and his other books. Incidentally, if you want to talk about racism and those problems, read Pudd'nhead Wilson. That'll get you straight on Twain's view.
Yes,
also,
I love the book.
Living under the shadow of all these other rather serious issues, it's easy to forget that this is a very funny book, and it's a great adventure story. And let's not devalue those things.
Can I just read one quick short thing?
Please.
To me, the kind of appeal that Mark Twain has that hardly anybody else does, that stays. This is in a funeral. When the place was packed full, the undertaker, he slid around in his black gloves with his softy, soothing ways, putting on the last touches and getting people and things all ship-shape and comfortable, and making no more sound than a cat. He never spoke. He moved people around. He squeezed in late people. He opened up passageways, done it all with nods and signs with his hands. Then he took his place over against the wall. He was the softest, glidingest, stealthiest man I ever see. There weren't no more smile to him than there is to a ham. Then the Reverend Hobson opened up, slow and solemn, and begun to talk, and straight off the most outrageous row busted out in the cellar a body ever heard. It was only one dog, but he made a most powerful racket, and he kept it up right along. Parson, he had to stand there over the coffin and wait. You couldn't hear it yourself think. It was right awkward, and nobody didn't seem to know what to do. But pretty soon they see that long-legged undertaker make a sign to the preacher, much as to say, "Don't you worry, just depend on me." He stooped down and began to glide along the wall, just his shoulders showing over the people's heads. So he glided along in the powwow and racket, getting more and more outrageous all the time. And at last, when he'd gone around two sides of the room, he disappeared down cellar. Then, in about 2 seconds, we heard a whack, and the dog, he finished up with the most amazing howl or two, and then everything was dead still, and the parson begun his solemn talk where he left off. In a minute or two, there comes the undertaker's back and shoulders gliding along the wall again. So he glided and glided around 3 sides of the room, and then rose up and shaded his mouth with his hands and stretched his neck out towards the preacher over the people's heads and says in a kind of coarse whisper, "He had a rat." He drooped down and glided along the wall into his place. You could see it was a great satisfaction to the people because naturally they wanted to know. A little thing like that don't cost nothing, and it's just the little things that makes a man.
That answers the question.
There weren't no more popular man in town than that undertaker.
Well, that answers the question, doesn't it?
I think it does. If anybody wants to ask a question as we go, you can stand at the mic right there right to you, and fire away.
This isn't a question. Could one of the members of the panel read Mark Twain's notice at the beginning of the book?
Yeah. Like my client after that morning.
Where is it?
Oh, here you are. Notice, persons attempting to find a motive in this narrative will be prosecuted. Persons attempting to find a moral in it will be banished. Persons attempting to find a plot in it will be shot.
Any questions? Huh? Mr. Kaplan, we were earlier discussing, before we came on, the virtues of tampering with a great work of art, or by restoring parts that were lost, and or putting in things from other drafts. How do you think the novel has fared under the restorations in this edition?
Well, I have to say that this new edition, which is very handsome and very ample and full of information, it is not meant to establish a new text or to replace the Huckleberry Finn that we all know, love, and presumably have read as well. What it does is to supplement the text and also feed our natural curiosity about how authors go about making books that we really value. For example, I find it fascinating to look at the title page of Charles Dickens's A Christmas Carol, and to see that the character that we now know as Tiny Tim was once known as Puny Pete and a few other alliterative names like that. It's not a matter of great moment, but if you care about an author's work, sometimes you care about how he goes about making it and what decisions that he makes. And the current edition involves a number of decisions to excise material. For example, the wonderful ghost story that Bill Murray read before so beautifully is a story and on the same level of quality as Mark Twain's terrific Golden Arm. But you can imagine that an author might feel that a monologue story like this might interrupt the flow and momentum of his narrative, and he might say very sagely, well, I like this, but, you know, as good writers do who are self-editors, they say, the more I love it, the more I think I'll have to kill it. You have to get rid of it. And there are a number of other decisions that you'll see at work in this edition.
So
I don't think it's tampering with the text. I think it feeds, as I said, our natural curiosity. I'd be interested to see the first draft of Hamlet. You might discover that Shakespeare decided to kill Claudius off in Act 1 and then realized to his horror that there was no play.
we have a question.
Yes, first, a very quick observation. It's been my perception that one index of narrow-mindedness seems to be the ability to focus only on a single word. I don't know if you gentlemen will agree with that. But it does bring out the larger issue, which very simply is, how do you reconcile the tension between the needs of those who might have certain sensitivities and the legitimate need for having certain literature as a part of our history where we can look back on it recognizing that it was not a perfect world in those days and that our history exists warts and all?
Yeah.
No, I don't see any need to reconcile things.
No, but certainly...
This is reality, and this is history. That's the way things were. This is in part a historical novel.
But the thing is, it's not recognized as such. As was pointed out, a young black teenager in school might very well be offended, seeing things on the page which he would have no difficulty uttering to his friends walking down that same school hallway. And that's what I can't quite get straight.
Well, that's what makes the book so fascinating. I think has been one little tiny fragment of Huck Finn has not been brought up tonight for some reason. It usually is. It's a scene toward the end where Tom Sawyer comes in. He's been on a steamboat and he's reporting to his aunt what has happened on the trip down to Arkansas. And he says there was an explosion on the boat. And his aunt says, well, Tom, land's sake, anyone hurt? He says offhand, no, killed a nigger. Now this is an extraordinary statement by modern standards. But in the context of 19th century, it has to be regarded as a kind of line that would have been said without any sense of prejudice.
The word nigger is not the same as words like wop or kike or hunky, which are all scornful. The word nigger is by no means necessarily scornful, although it's an indication of racism, of course, but it's not meant invariably as an insult.
Well, maybe I should jump in just a little bit at this point as a kind of street archaeologist of New York, or what happens, or anthropologist of New York, excuse me, what happens in any derisive term, there's a certain kind of license that's allowed for in-group people that's not allowed for out-group people.
Right.
I mean, that exists among Jews in New York. It exists among Italians in New York. My Italian friends call each other Guinea all the time.
Right.
But if I would walk into a room and say Guinea to an unknown Italian, I'm about to have my face rearranged.
Right.
So there's in-group license and there's out-group license, and that there's a kind of flux that exists in language, especially in big cities like this. It goes back and forth, and those boundaries rub up against each other all the time. So hence you could find someone who would find nigger in Twain's mouth objectionable, and who would find nigger in Public Enemy, the rap group, or Cypress Hill, perfectly euphonious. Question?
Yeah. One of the most striking things that I remember about that Harper's Magazine article was the point that the author made that Huck Finn was not a great novel sui generis, but it had been so canonized by what you might call a cabal of white men. And she did point out that there were a number of structural flaws with the novel. I think it's a very devastatingly sadistic piece of work as a novel. But what bothers me about it is that I think it goes over the heads of most of the people that read it. I think you have to be very sophisticated and worldly to really get what Twain was getting at. And when you put it in the hands of elementary or junior high school, even high school kids, especially a lot of white kids or in a mixed group, you're getting people that don't see, the brilliance of the novel, and what you get is pandering to the worst common denominator. And it's the same problem I have with August Wilson's plays. I mean, I don't care how many Pulitzer Prizes he wins. If you're in a mixed group and he's got nigger every other line, you know, you wonder why white people like him so much. You wonder if it's because he's really brilliant or because it's really feeding their worst instinct and their basest feelings on some level. And that's the problem I really have with Huck Finn.
Well, I think it's, I'm sorry, I mean, I think that I've been looking at nigger particularly all through here, and while I reread the book, and it seems to me that Mark Twain is always, he's never using it casually. It seems to me, I mean, people are using it casually, but every time it's used, it comes in a moment when, I don't know, where, so, you know, so in the next sentence, it's like the steamboat thing. Nobody was killed. Nobody was hurt. I mean, he's obviously, and I mean, I agree that it could cause trouble in classroom. I wonder whether anybody ought to be made to read Huck Finn. I mean, it might spoil it to make it compulsory. Yeah? But and I can see, a lot of things would bother me, I think, if I were a black reader. But I do think that Mark Twain was courageously going at the sore point there, and he knew that he was not just tossing the word off. He's using it in a really embarrassing way a lot of times.
The novelist David Bradley said he says that calculation Mr. Blount just spoke of, David Bradley said that calculation is so precise that you can iterate the difference between Tom and Huck.
The way they use that.
Yeah, the way they use it. And he said when Huck uses it, he's generally talking about a person. You know, and when Tom uses it, he's generally talking about an animal. So, but that may in fact be a little bit much for 8th graders, and that's one of the debates that's happening now. And without taking too much time, I think that the novel ought to be taught, but it ought to be taught. You know what I'm saying? Somebody's got to go there and say, make the kind of observations that writers are making every day about the differences in usage depending on who's speaking, and in-group and out-group and so on. Next question.
Yeah, I'm a slight change of subject. Twain expressed his distaste for people like Walter Scott and made fun of Americans' adulation of European culture. And I'd like to hear any of the panel speak to that side of Twain with relationship to Huck Finn.
Twain couldn't abide what he thought of as stuffiness out of anybody under any circumstances. Those of you who've read his essay on, thank God I've forgotten his name, James Fenimore Cooper. Oh yeah, it's a very funny thing. He takes him to task something awful, and it's very, very funny. But later on in life, somebody asked him about Jane Austen. He said, "Well, I can read Fenimore Cooper for money if I'm paid to do it, but I couldn't read Jane Austen for money."
I just would like to make one comment and then a question for the panel. But on Twain being compulsory, I once heard a quote attributed to Twain where he said that he didn't think anyone should be forced to read his book, especially young people, because he had been forced to read the King James Bible as a young man, and he didn't think he had ever recovered. That was Twain on compulsory education. The other question I have for the panel is someone alluded to the last part of the book, and I think there's pretty much universal agreement that when Tom Sawyer re-enters the novel, there's a deflation. One thing that occurred to me, and I don't know if anyone else has written about this, is that perhaps Twain is having a sort of social commentary, that this book's written 20 years after the Emancipation Proclamation, and life in America still isn't very good for those of African descent. And in the same way that Jim's in that cabin, legally a free man, and yet still treated as a piece of property by Tom Sawyer. And I was just curious if there has been any comment on that, if Twain had that in mind with the last. I'm always looking for a way to defend the last fifth of the book. And,
yeah, all through the book there are people treating other people and even dogs and things like objects. And it just amounts to this sort of crescendo of absurd objectification and romance. And I just read the last part this afternoon, the first time in a long time, and it's just really crazy. But maybe it's appropriately crazy. I mean, maybe what else are you going to do? I don't know. It's sort of Tom Sawyer kind of messes things up. Whereas it seems to me that Huck and Jim are often in not the same shape, but Huck understates everything, and not just about slavery, but about Huck is a gravely abused child, and his father nearly beats him to death. And the way he describes being nearly beaten to death is understated in the same way that he talks about slavery, whereas Tom just blows everything. I mean, inflates everything, builds everything up. So it's a sudden shift in style that is hard to adjust to.
Yeah, I agree with Roy that it's appropriately crazy. I mean, I'm willing to live with it. It doesn't bother me that much. But I think you take a more charitable view of the ending if you realize that the whole premise of the book is a little loony to begin with. It's an impossible premise, and that is why would Jim be running farther down south every minute? He's going in the wrong direction. And Huck says, why would a runaway slave run south?
Well, that's what Mrs. Smiley got very angry about. Why go down the river? Why go down the river when they could have crossed over into Illinois, which is about 2 miles away?
Well, that's exactly like saying, why doesn't Hamlet kill Claudius in Act 1? You can't do it.
Please, don't be shy. Step right up.
My favorite line in the novel is when Jim says that French people have a different word for everything. So maybe we have Francophiles after us in the novel. But I think that when I read the James Smiley piece, I came away, I kept wanting to say to the article, it's the best boy you could hope to find in Mississippi in the late 1800s.
Right. That's the point. That's what I was trying to say.
Yeah. And I ride the subways all the time, and what's happening now, which is making me very uncomfortable, is teenagers using the word nigger. It's started with darker-skinned Hispanics, and now lighter-skinned Hispanics and Asians and Middle Eastern teenagers in groups, mixed racial groups. And you see people on the subway, it's the older folks that are like, because here's, a Korean or Chinese kid going, damn, nigger, to his friend. And it's all the adults with their shoulders up. But the kids are just talking. And I'm waiting for something to happen. It's something.
Well, what's going to happen is the usages are going to wax and wane. What you're looking at the language stew of the city. And it's uncomfortable. But it's like tectonic plates of meaning that scrape against one another. And it is unseemly and uncomfortable sometimes when that happens. But count yourself lucky to be in New York.
Right.
Now we got all these mics out here, so don't be shy. Step up, and you can be on TV at that point too. But you can step in the back, and we'll do your makeup at that point. Do you think, gentlemen, that Southern writers, in particular, are just too enamored of the minstrel type? Ellison tries to defend, or tries to plumb modern black revulsion at the Jim character. But do you think that, and three of you are Southerners, so I put that to you, do you think Southern writers are historically just too enamored of that type?
I think there's some truth in the charge. It's an effective type that's been used over and over again. I wrote a novel in which I had to write about some bourgeois blacks. I've never known any bourgeois blacks. All I've known is servants and doctors and judges and things. So I had a terrible time familiarizing myself with it enough to try to handle it. I think that side of black life has been neglected. I look forward to a time when black writers can write about white people the way white people feel free to write about black people. I feel that nearly all black writers are carrying a heavy burden, a very heavy burden, which I wish they could unload.
Amen, Mr.
Right?
Mr. Foot.
Right.
Hard to stand up under it.
But the thing that Twain that we've been talking about, to charge him with being backward on this subject, race, is to ignore everything else about his personality. He was not on the back of anything. When you read his complaints about the Spanish-American War, it makes Vietnam protests look mild indeed. Twain is fierce on the subject of war. He's fierce on the subject of lynching, and he's out front of everything else. And why you think he's not out front on this racial thing, I'm not too sure. Well, because he is.
Well, I'm just Miss Smiley, so don't.
Right.
I'm with you.
Right.
Yes, sir.
I'm no Twain scholar, so maybe you guys can do a little homework for me. I read this book by Julie Smith that I really enjoyed that mentions Mr. Kaplan called Huckleberry Fiend, and one of the sub-themes of it is that Twain's best work was heavily edited, if not almost co-authored by his wife, Olivia Langdon, and that a bunch of the stuff that didn't get into print was the stuff that Olivia Langdon didn't work on or didn't edit. Is this just fiction, or is there anything to that?
And I think that's highly exaggerated. And also, if you would realize that let's say the dynamic of someone like Mark Twain, it's very easy for him to blame self-censorship on his wife. It's a very easy way out.
He could write. I mean, he didn't need an editor. I mean, one thing the man could do is write. He could write.
The thing that has to be held on in my mind about Twain is, never mind an author's personality, but Twain's personality is so much a part of his writing that it's well to keep it in mind. He saw himself as a ridiculous person on many occasions, and frequently said so. I heard about him one time. He liked to be alone and nobody bothering him while he was writing, but he didn't want to shut the door because he didn't want to close the world off. It's a strange thing. I have that same thing. I don't know where it comes from. But anyway, he's sitting there writing at his desk, and the door's open, and there's a hall outside. And one of his little girls rode past on a tricycle, and he frowned. And in a minute, she came back the other way, and he frowned worse. And the third time she passed, he got up and threw the pen down and said, "Damn it, no writer should ever be married." but the reason I keep stressing Twain's personality is I think it's so much a part of Huck Finn, everything about him. And no matter how rough and tumble he is, and this is a frontier society he's writing about, and Huck's going to light out for the territory. No matter what he does, this essential lovableness is the wrong word, but this is essential humor to the man it permeates everything he writes.
I keep thinking I ought to respond to the minstrel thing, but I don't know exactly what to say. I mean, you can see in the one thing about Jim also not being a more assertive character, I think, is that you can just see it working in the book how little option Jim has to speak up. I mean, right. He's got to. I mean, geez, he's going to be. He can't say he's going to be sold down the river. He's in terrible trouble, and Huck is in the same trouble with him most of the time. But I mean, he's not going to get sold down the river, but he's trapped with the king and the duke because they're going to turn Jim in as a runaway slave. And there are a lot. Black people in the South were certainly repressed, and it came out. And I never really had much sense of the minstrel character, but there's the blues character, for instance, which I do admire.
I saw minstrel shows when they were in their glory back in the late 20s. Algie Fields and Lassie's White and all of them. It'd be extremely embarrassing to see one of them today. The people in blackface and everything, it would excruciate you. But this Mark Twain thing, this racism at Twain, I don't think anybody today can realize how it permeated all of society. It was absolutely part of our lives, and it was made part of our lives probably on purpose. It's just some genius invented it so as you'll have cheap labor all your life. It's not easy to understand.
Also, anyone who, like Shelby and I think Roy, were you born during segregation?
Yeah. I never went to school with a black person until graduate school.
That's right. Well, anyone who has been through segregation, like all of us, in the South, remember truly, to my mind, lacerating experience. And I say that because I think it's overlooked that as horrible as segregation was, and Jim Crow, it worked a terrible, it created a terrible wound in the souls of a lot of white people too. I'm not trying to get white people off the hook, but this system, which was part of history, sort of inexorably rolled up as a result of agricultural capitalism, created a terrible burden for an entire society. It has to be remembered.
And if Southern white people have any sense at all, they remember that. And that, I mean, what I hate is when people like Ronald Reagan say, I don't have a racist bone in my body. I didn't know that. I mean, anybody that's pre-racist. That means you haven't gotten as far as the rest of it.
It's like saying he doesn't have a bone in his body.
We got a question here.
Right.
One of the things I haven't seen or heard much about tonight is except for the last person who mentioned censorship by his wife, Twain had an extreme need, from my reading of him, to be respectable, to be civilized. And I think the extreme case of that was the book Personal Recollections of Joan of Arc. The side of him did not sell very well. That's why we're not here tonight talking about Joan of Arc. But I think probably that conflict between, as Mr. Foote said, the man he really was, and the man that he wanted to be, the respectable kind of person, probably helped power his books.
Well, if he were altogether consistent, he'd be a much less interesting person.
Right.
I had the grim duty of writing an introduction to Joan of Arc, which is a book that really fills me full of dismay. But it becomes an interesting chapter in this writer's life, because he very often alternates between, let's say, autonomous urges and then the need, as you say, to be respectable and to sell well, and he does sell out, and he hates himself for it. And there's no straight line in this man's life.
Thank you. I guess we'll wind up and let the gentlemen sign books if they wish. But at this point, I guess I can drop my disguise of Jane Smiley and tell you what I think. Basically, I look upon Twain as one of very few real genuine seers in our culture or in the world. I think of, to spread them far apart, I think of Shakespeare as one seer. I think of Othello, especially on the issue of race, I think of Othello as a play that saw all of the psychology of race hundreds of years before it ever manifested itself on a grand scale. Saw it all. And I think of my fellow Virginian Thomas Jefferson at that level in the founding of the Republic, and I think of Twain a little time later as a real seer of the complexities of race and this real dance that would go on in perpetuity between blacks and whites. And we're still dancing it because we're still here tonight, and thank you all for coming. Good night.
Good to see you.